When Super Mario 64 was released, it kinda became an unofficial rule that every single video game has to be a 3D platformer, for better or worse. Earthworm Jim 3D is the third game in the Earthworm Jim series, following the two games on the Genesis and Super Nintendo, and as the name suggests, is Earthworm Jim's shot at capturing some of that Mario 64 magic. The 2D games are often remembered very fondly, much more so than the third game. Judging from the things that I've read, Earthworm Jim 3D was a classic case of literally everything going wrong. Which is to say there was a degree of hype involved in addition to a lot of delays, but not the good Miyamoto kind of delays, the stupid we don't know what the hell we're doing so let's throw the entire game in the garbage can and fish it out 3 times kind of delays. You know, Duke Nukem forever. The hype train as a way of building games up to be something far greater than they could actually live up to. This has been true since video games started, and it remains especially true today. It's a lesson we've learned again and again and again, and we'll probably learn a few more times in the future. Like, for all I know, that 3D Kirby is gonna suck major ass, so I guess we'll just have to wait and see. The promotional material for Earthworm Jim 3D looked fucking badass. You had Jim sliding down a slide of death on a pig, you had a ton of really huge and awesome looking levels with a lot going on. There's this part in the scary level where a giant severed hand tries to grab you like Zelda. You got Jim riding a rocket in 3D like in the older games, except with actual graphics now. All of this looks like it was shaping up to be a very good game, especially considering it was delayed numerous times, all the way back to 1999. Then the game comes out and says, actually none of that stuff is in the game at all. Guess we fucking lied. Even the back of the box has the balls to use pre-release screenshots of the game that didn't make the final cut. Well, at least the European version. Maybe they just hate Europe, I don't know. Suffice it to say, the game went through a huge number of changes throughout its long and storied development process, and there is enough footage and documentation of the pre-release versions of this game that it could honestly be its own video if I felt like it. But right now I don't. Now, if you've watched me for a while, you may have figured out that I have a lot of nostalgia for Jim 3D. It was one of my childhood games that I played the absolute living shit out of, and so did the rest of my family. We'd always be watching each other play it, we'd be doing funny voices. I remember my brother got stuck on Fat Ass Fatty Roswell. My dad would quote it every now and then. It's a game that means a lot to me because it reminds me of much simpler times when me and my family would just be having fun and we didn't have to worry about taxes and cholesterol levels and shit. I actually feel like this game is one of the reasons I learned how to speak and read. There was no way I would have known back then that this was pronounced data if my dad didn't point it out. I was like 3, so cut me a break. Back in those days, I didn't have any of the context of the first 2 games or the cartoon show that this game was attempting to tie into, or the promotional pre-release materials at all, and combined with having a very limited repertoire of games in general, I guess it just never occurred to me that this was a bad game because I had very little to compare it to. Now, before I talk about this game, it is worth noting that there are a few ways to play it today. Originally, it was released on the N64 and the PC. I happen to own a copy of both versions. Fundamentally, they're pretty much identical, besides the textures, resolution, and frame rate being way better on the PC, naturally. The PC version also has the full uncompressed soundtrack, and even though it doesn't loop, it's a hell of a lot better and more crisp sounding than the N64 version. I will say this about the N64 though. Although the overall sound quality is fuzzier, it does have really cool audio effects applied to a lot of the sound effects in the game, which have a way of adding a lot of atmosphere in certain situations, which, from what I can tell, doesn't seem to happen in the PC version.
3, 2, 1.
There's also this really cool thing in the N64 version where if you touch the needle on the disco level, the actual level theme skips and restarts. I should probably mention that you can find the PC version on Steam, although it doesn't have the music because it's an old game and back then all the music was stored on the CD. I should also bring up that the N64 version is playable on an emulator, obviously, but having played it that way a whole bunch of times, I must warn that it's very broken compared to the other methods, so it's a little hard to recommend, but Let's talk about the actual game now, shall we? The story for this game is incredible. Jim gets bonked on the head by a cow which fucks with his brains, and you have to play not as him but as his super ego, which, if your English teacher didn't talk about Sigmund Freud 87 plus times in high school, refers to the ethical component of the personality and provides the moral standards by which the ego operates. The superego's criticisms, prohibitions, and inhibitions form a person's conscience, and its positive aspirations and ideals represent one's idealized self-image or ego ideal. Yeah. Or, you know, it's a tiny version of Earthworm Jim that shoots grandmas with a revolver. The cow incident made Jim lose his marbles, so he has to recollect them all. It also may have awakened some form of gender dysphoria as well, but I'm not a doctor, so that's not for me to say. Jim's superego must travel across 4 different worm brains to regain his sanity. One for his memory, one for his happiness, one for his fear, and the final one for his fantasy. His memory is represented by repressed memories of a great farmyard war that happened when he was a child. A farmyard war, huh? I almost wonder if this game is secretly very political. His happiness is represented by food, because nothing makes Jim happy like food. He's a simple man after all. His fear is represented by books, because he's stupid. And his fantasy is represented by Cowboy Land. You know, I have some cowboy fantasies of my own, but well, they're a little different. You know, the concept of exploring one's mind is pretty cool, and it almost reminds me of something like Psychonauts, which came out a few years afterwards. In fact, part of me almost wonders if Psychonauts was inspired in some way by Earthworm Jim 3D, although I imagine most game developers probably wouldn't be comfortable telling people that Earthworm Jim 3D was inspiring to them, so I guess they'll never admit it one way or another. One thing that I didn't know until a while later is that this game was actually based much more heavily on the Earthworm Jim cartoon show than the previous games, which is a bit of an interesting decision, considering the show had already been off the air for a couple years at that point. It's worth mentioning that I haven't watched very much of the show still, but what I have seen is honestly pretty funny, and I think Dan Castellaneta was an excellent choice for Jim, which makes it all the more impressive that they actually brought him back to voice the game. And I gotta say, Jim's voice is just a joy to listen to in Jim 3D. It's probably one of the most endearing qualities of the game, and I think Dan did an excellent job bringing him to life. It's especially funny whenever he gets hurt. Even as an adult, there are a lot of funny things in this game. You got Gunnery Sergeant Mussolini, get it? Because he's a cow. There's this dumb idiot minigame where you have to try and herd grandmas into a pen.
They're pretty scattered. Let's get them all rounded up.
You got grandmas with shotguns that do 15% of your health if they hit you. You got this old lady with pendulous breasts at the reception of the disco. Yeah, this game's really weird about old people. You shoot the zombies' heads off and they chase you. There's suicide bomber rabbits that blow you up and it's terrifying. You got Yosemite Sam taking a shit and you shoot him while hanging off of a wire, and when he dies, the brown waterfall below him disappears, as if to insinuate that it's just a perpetual waterfall of shit that's coming out of one person. What did this man eat? Jesus Christ. You got the cow enemies that can only be killed by slicing their heads off with a butcher knife boomerang. I tell you, man, the kinds of things you could fit into an E rating back in the day.
Damn, I'm groovy!
In retrospect, it almost feels as though the developers of the game were kinda banking on the over-the-top nonsense of the Earthworm Jim universe to sell the game and to do a lot of the heavy lifting, while the other aspects of the game are relatively average by comparison. But let's talk about the game itself. The gameplay loop is a lot closer to Banjo-Kazooie than Mario 64 in that you enter the level, collect everything, and then dip, instead of getting kicked out of the level every time you find a golden shiny. The golden udders are basically the jiggies and stars, and you need to collect all of them in order to beat the game. The marbles, on the other hand, are like the notes, and you need to collect a lot of them in order to enter the next level of the game. Much like Banjo, you can't take the marbles off of the world. Instead, you have to get the highest marble score up to a maximum of 100 per level, much like Banjo's note scores. Jim is equipped with a blaster and a whip move where he whips you with his worm body, much like the older games. It's not perfect, but when it works, it's really not that bad. Enemies have different attack patterns. These stupid robots need to be stunned with a blaster and then whipped. The grandmas are invincible if they're doing the splits. The zombie chickens keep going invincible. There's this vacuum cleaner that you need to kill with a dynamite banana. There's all kinds of different weapons you can get, although they tend to be more incidental rather than being a collection of things you can swap between when you feel like it. It can be repetitive and frustrating at times, but it's definitely playable. One thing that pisses me off though is the extra lives. Again, seemingly using Banjo-Kazooie as the template, the extra lives are completely useless because once you die, you lose all your marbles, and if you lose all your lives, it just boots you to the title screen, which is barely a consequence because it just means you had to walk back to the level. I must say, I'm pretty happy that developers are finally catching on to the fact that this kind of design is just outdated. So the big thing is collectibles and exploration. The levels are unique and different from each other. You got the barnyard, the fast food factory with Elvis, the disco zombie pad, the Wild West level. There is some variety here. It definitely can't live up to a lot of its contemporaries, and the more I play the game, the more I come to realize that the big thing that probably killed this game is how underwhelming it must have been a year after Banjo-Kazooie, and the same year as games like Donkey Kong 64 and Rayman 2. But again, it's still very playable and even fun a lot of the time. Fundamentally, I feel like the game isn't that bad, but it's just not as consistent as one would hope. It's got a handful of shitty moments like the stupid swamp level with the balloon, the dumbass beaver that chases you across the map, the stupid wasps that eat your ice cream, the Elvis minigame trying to pay homage to For Pete's Sake from the original game. Then there's this Ice Cube minigame which you can just skip entirely by immediately jumping back onto the fridge and just watching the show. Then you have the boss battles. Now these get a lot of shit, but in my experience, they're actually the easier part of the game. The goal of the boss fights is to collect all 100 blue marbles, which means you have to shoot the bosses to make them drop the marbles they're carrying. Meanwhile, they can shoot you too, but when they shoot you, you lose marbles and health at the same time, which can be a real fucker if you're not careful. I think what a lot of people struggle with is dodging the missiles. The timing is pretty tight, and if you're playing on an emulator for instance, it's almost impossible because Jim's jump lasts for 5 frames, making it basically useless. Other than that, I actually found them pretty manageable. Well, Bob the Goldfish is still a bastard though. Looking back at this game again, I'm actually surprised at how much variety there is. The stupid bullshit parts aside, you can actually find some very neat moments in this game, like how you need to find and destroy all of the surveillance cameras in the barnyard level, or this section where you need to ricochet lasers off of frying pans to light them all up at the same time, or the Wild West level where you need to shoot down old corn liquor jugs sitting over top of the world. The dialogue is funny some of the time, but part of me feels like the writers were imagining it all being voice acted. I feel like it's less funny to read dialogue like this as opposed to hearing it coming out of a person's mouth. I realize that it probably wasn't feasible to do this on a Nintendo 64 game without some major work, and judging from what we know about its development cycle, more major work was probably the last thing on their mind, but I guess that's just how it be. From the standpoint of presentation, this game is actually pretty solid. Again, its contemporaries probably look better, but there's a lot of instances where it looks quite good, especially the PC version. It stays true to a cartoonish aesthetic, it's animated and expressive. The animations have that distinctive early 3D video game vibe about them, where they animated frames without any interpolation between them. It's definitely dated, but it's fun to look at. You got that disco floor that disappears under your feet if you're not careful, you got lighting effects and rich textures, at least on the PC, and then there's the soundtrack. This game's soundtrack is just full of bangers, and I would be remiss if I didn't point that out. even though playing the game today is still kind of fun, at least to me, my question is, what the hell happened to all of those really cool levels? You can see some elements of the pre-release footage in the game, but there are entire massive sections that just aren't present. And this isn't like Banjo-Kazooie, where it's mostly just unfinished placeholders. It's like entire things were planned for the game that looked like they were pretty deep into production, judging from the footage, and looked like they were in a playable state, and then they were just flat out removed because reasons. Like the 2D sections and sliding down the death slides on a pig in this weird level with all these tiled platforms. And where the hell is Evil the Cat? I mean, yeah, you can see him on the record players, but come on, man. According to legend, there were certain pre-release materials which claimed Evil the Cat was actually going to be a boss in the game, even after the decision was made that it would be NFT for a head instead, but it's a little tricky to confirm one way or another based on what I read. But in any case, let me just say that it would have been really cool to see him. He was one of my favorite parts of the cartoon. So when all is said and done, what is my final verdict on Earthworm Jim 3D? While setting aside my nostalgia, I would say that it's a slightly above average game. It's not some masterpiece hidden gem that's gonna make you want to drop $100 on an N64 and a copy of the game right away, but I do recommend it if you're curious. I will reiterate that the emulated versions tend to be a little on the dysfunctional side in some respects, but if you can put up with that, it is a way to play the game. Otherwise, the Steam version is only 22 Canadian, Jesus Christ.
Great googly woogly!
Okay, don't buy the Steam version, but Earthworm Jim 3D is, in my opinion, a good game with a lot of personality, and if you can put up with some dumb shit here and there, you may be able to get some enjoyment out of it as I have.